Something extraordinary happened to Western intellectuals in the 20th century. They began treating political movements like religions, complete with infallible doctrines, sacred texts, and heretical thoughts that could not be questioned. I witnessed this transformation firsthand, watching brilliant minds abandon critical thinking the moment they embraced ideological systems that promised to explain everything about human society and history. The danger isn't merely academic. When politics assumes the psychological function of religion, providing total meaning, absolute certainty, and unquestionable truths, democratic debate becomes impossible. Citizens stop reasoning together and start performing acts of faith. The marketplace of ideas transforms into a battlefield of competing orthodoxies, each claiming exclusive access to historical truth. This political religiosity manifests across the spectrum. Whether it's the Marxist who sees class struggle as the key to all history, the nationalist who believes their nation embodies perfect virtue, or the progressive who treats social justice as an unquestionable moral imperative, the pattern remains consistent. Complexity disappears. Doubt becomes betrayal. And the intellectual humility that democracy requires gets sacrificed on the altar of ideological purity. Understanding how politics becomes religion isn't just an academic exercise. It's essential for preserving the space where democratic citizens can think, argue, and change their minds without losing their souls in the process. Chapter 1: The Sacred and the Political: How Ideologies Fill the God-Shaped Hole. The relationship between religious faith and political commitment has always been complex, but something fundamentally changed in the modern era. As traditional religious authority declined in Western societies, political ideologies began assuming functions previously reserved for sacred belief systems. This wasn't simply a matter of politics becoming more important, it was politics becoming transcendent. I observed this phenomenon most clearly among French intellectuals who embraced communism with religious fervor. These weren't merely people who thought Marxist economics made sense or that the Soviet Union had good policies. They exhibited what I can only describe as converts' enthusiasm, the joy of those who had found ultimate meaning in historical materialism, who saw themselves as chosen instruments of inevitable progress, who could no longer imagine being wrong about fundamental questions. This political faith provided what psychologists call cognitive closure, the relief of no longer having to wrestle with uncertainty. Marx's dialectical materialism offered a master key that unlocked all of history's mysteries. Class struggle explained everything from art to religion to family structures. The proletariat's victory was scientifically guaranteed. Believers could finally stop the exhausting work of thinking through each situation afresh. But observe what happened to these brilliant minds once they achieved this closure. They lost the capacity for genuine surprise. When Soviet policies contradicted their expectations, they performed increasingly elaborate intellectual gymnastics rather than questioning their framework. When evidence emerged of Stalin's crimes, they either denied it outright or explained it away as necessary for the greater good. The ideology had become too psychologically valuable to abandon. This pattern isn't unique to communism. I've watched similar transformations among believers in other totalizing systems: fascists who found ultimate meaning in racial destiny, nationalists who discovered transcendent purpose in ethnic superiority, even democratic progressives who treat social justice as an unquestionable moral absolute. The content varies, but the psychological structure remains constant. What makes political religion so seductive is that it offers something liberal democracy cannot: certainty about ultimate questions. Democracy asks citizens to live with ambiguity, to accept that good people can disagree about fundamental values, to build provisional consensus while remaining open to revision. This is intellectually honest but psychologically demanding. Political religions promise to end this existential burden by providing absolute answers. The result is a kind of spiritual comfort that comes at the price of intellectual integrity. True political wisdom requires holding our deepest convictions lightly enough to examine them critically. When politics becomes religion, this becomes impossible. The believer cannot afford to doubt because doubt threatens not just their opinions but their entire source of meaning and identity. Understanding this psychological dynamic is crucial for anyone who wants to maintain both strong political commitments and intellectual honesty. The challenge isn't to become indifferent to politics but to hold our political beliefs in a way that preserves our capacity for critical thinking and genuine dialogue with those who disagree. Chapter 2: The Opium of the Intellectuals: How Smart People Fall for Simple Answers. The most disturbing aspect of political religion isn't that it attracts the ignorant or desperate, it's how powerfully it appeals to sophisticated intellectuals who should know better. I spent decades observing some of France's most brilliant minds surrender their critical faculties to ideological systems that promised comprehensive explanations for all human problems. This phenomenon reveals something troubling about intellectual life itself. The very qualities that make someone a good scholar, deep knowledge, systematic thinking, the ability to see patterns, can become liabilities when applied to political movements that claim scientific certainty about historical processes. An intellectual who has mastered complex philosophical systems may feel uniquely qualified to grasp the scientific laws of social development that Marxism promised to reveal. Consider how this worked in practice. Brilliant philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre could write sophisticated analyses of human consciousness while simultaneously defending Stalin's show trials. Talented historians could produce nuanced studies of medieval society while accepting crude Marxist generalizations about class struggle as the motor of all historical change. Their intellectual sophistication actually made them more vulnerable to ideological seduction, not less. The mechanism is subtle but powerful. Intellectuals are accustomed to finding coherent explanations for complex phenomena. When an ideology offers a unified theory that explains everything from economics to culture to international relations, it appeals to the scholarly instinct for systematic understanding. The intellectual feels they've found the missing piece that makes all their specialized knowledge fit together into a grand picture. This creates what I call intellectual pride masquerading as humility. The true believer claims to serve something greater than themselves, the laws of history, the march of progress, the cause of justice. But this apparent self-effacement actually feeds enormous intellectual ego. The believer becomes a privileged interpreter of historical necessity, someone who understands what the masses cannot grasp, someone on the right side of inevitable change. The tragedy is that this false humility destroys genuine intellectual virtue. Real scholarship requires acknowledging the limits of our knowledge, accepting that complex problems may not have simple solutions, remaining open to evidence that contradicts our preferred theories. Political religion makes all of this impossible by transforming intellectual activity from investigation into propaganda. I watched this transformation happen to colleagues who had been genuine scholars before their conversion to revolutionary politics. Their work became increasingly rigid, their analysis more predictable, their engagement with opposing viewpoints purely strategic rather than genuinely curious. They retained all their technical skills while losing the intellectual honesty that makes those skills valuable. The antidote isn't anti-intellectualism but better intellectual habits. We need scholars who can hold their expertise lightly enough to acknowledge uncertainty, who can pursue systematic understanding without claiming comprehensive knowledge, who can maintain strong convictions while preserving capacity for self-correction. This requires distinguishing between intellectual confidence and ideological certainty, a distinction that political religions deliberately obscure. The stakes are higher than academic integrity. When intellectuals abandon critical thinking for ideological comfort, they abdicate their responsibility to serve democratic discourse. Instead of helping citizens think through complex problems, they provide sophisticated rationalizations for predetermined conclusions. This betrays both scholarship and citizenship. Chapter 3: The Mechanics of Faith: how doubt becomes heresy in political movements. Watch carefully how political movements police the boundaries of acceptable thought, and you'll observe mechanisms identical to those used by religious institutions to maintain doctrinal purity. The transformation of legitimate skepticism into dangerous heresy follows predictable patterns that reveal the essentially religious psychology of ideological commitment. Every political faith develops its own version of blasphemy, questions that cannot be asked, evidence that cannot be acknowledged, conclusions that cannot be drawn. In communist circles, questioning the inevitability of proletarian revolution became a form of apostasy. Among nationalist movements, examining the actual historical record of ethnic relations threatens sacred narratives of victimization and superiority. In contemporary progressive spaces, challenging certain assumptions about identity and power can result in immediate excommunication. The process typically begins with subtle social pressure. The potential heretic finds their questions met not with counterarguments but with expressions of shock and disappointment. "How can you even think that?" becomes a more powerful response than logical refutation. The message is clear: good people don't have such doubts. Questioning the movement's fundamental premises isn't just wrong, it's a sign of moral deficiency. As pressure intensifies, the community develops sophisticated techniques for handling dissent without actually addressing it. Inconvenient questions get reinterpreted as psychological problems. The doubter is accused of suffering from false consciousness, internalized oppression, or reactionary nostalgia. Their concerns aren't engaged intellectually but diagnosed pathologically. This transforms political disagreement into spiritual counseling. The heretic needs healing, not debate. I witnessed this dynamic repeatedly during the Cold War, watching how communist intellectuals handled evidence of Soviet brutality. Rather than examine the implications of Stalin's crimes for their broader worldview, they developed elaborate explanations that preserved their faith while accounting for uncomfortable facts. The problem wasn't the ideology but insufficient understanding of its complexities. True believers just needed deeper study of dialectical materialism to see why apparent contradictions were actually confirmations. This mechanism serves crucial psychological functions for the political faithful. It protects them from the anxiety of genuine uncertainty while maintaining their sense of intellectual sophistication. They can acknowledge difficult facts while preserving their fundamental commitments. The ideology becomes unfalsifiable. Every apparent contradiction becomes evidence of the critic's inadequate understanding. The social costs are enormous. Once a movement adopts this approach to dissent, genuine learning becomes impossible. Members stop bringing forward problems they observe because they know such reports will be interpreted as symptoms rather than information. Innovation ceases because all proposed changes get filtered through ideological requirements. The movement becomes increasingly disconnected from reality while growing more confident in its righteousness. Democratic societies require citizens capable of changing their minds when presented with new evidence. This becomes impossible when political commitments assume religious intensity. The believer cannot afford to be wrong because being wrong would mean losing not just an opinion but their entire framework for understanding the world. Breaking free from this dynamic requires what I call principled doubt, the willingness to question our deepest convictions while maintaining genuine commitment to democratic values. This isn't relativism or cynicism but intellectual courage. It means holding our political beliefs firmly enough to act on them while lightly enough to revise them when reality demands it. Chapter 4: The Promise of Certainty: Why Democracy Disappoints Political Believers. Democracy's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness in the eyes of political believers. It institutionalizes uncertainty. Unlike ideological systems that promise final answers to fundamental questions, democratic governance assumes that reasonable people will disagree about important matters and creates procedures for managing this disagreement without violence. For those seeking ultimate truth in politics, this is profoundly unsatisfying. Consider what democracy actually offers its citizens. Instead of revealing the laws of history, it provides periodic elections whose outcomes depend on unpredictable factors. Instead of implementing scientifically determined policies, it produces messy compromises between competing interests. Instead of eliminating conflict, it channelizes conflict into nonviolent forms that must be continually renegotiated. This is a remarkable achievement from the perspective of human flourishing, but it feels inadequate to those who want politics to provide transcendent meaning. Political religions promise something more appealing: the end of uncertainty through the discovery of objective truth about social organization. Marxism claimed to have identified the scientific laws governing historical development. Fascism promised to reveal the eternal principles of racial hierarchy and national destiny. Contemporary ideological movements offer their own versions of absolute knowledge about oppression, justice, and human nature. These systems appeal to deep psychological needs that democracy deliberately leaves unfulfilled. Humans naturally crave certainty about fundamental questions: who are we? Where are we going? What does life mean? Traditional religions addressed these needs through revelation and faith. Political religions offer to satisfy them through reason and science, claiming to have discovered objective truths about society that eliminate the need for continued debate. Democracy, by contrast, treats these ultimate questions as permanently open. It assumes that citizens' deepest values will continue evolving, that new circumstances will require fresh thinking, that even the most cherished principles may need revision in light of experience. This philosophical humility enables peaceful coexistence between people with different worldviews, but it denies the psychological comfort of absolute certainty. The practical implications are enormous. Democratic politicians must acknowledge the limitations of their knowledge and the possibility they might be wrong. They must build coalitions among people who disagree about fundamental questions. They must accept that their finest achievements might be reversed by future elections. This requires a kind of ego discipline that political believers find unbearable. Ideological movements, by contrast, can promise their followers that they represent the forces of historical progress, that their eventual victory is guaranteed by scientific laws, that their opponents are not merely wrong but objectively evil. This transforms ordinary political conflict into cosmic drama, giving individual believers the sense that their participation serves ultimate purposes. I observed this dynamic repeatedly during the Cold War, watching how communist intellectuals responded to democratic procedures. They couldn't simply disagree with democratic outcomes, they had to explain why democracy itself was illegitimate. Elections reflected false consciousness rather than genuine preferences. Democratic institutions served bourgeois class interests rather than human needs. Parliamentary debate was ideological mystification rather than genuine deliberation. This wasn't mere strategic rhetoric but genuine incomprehension. Once you believe you possess scientific knowledge about historical necessity, democratic uncertainty becomes literally irrational. Why consult public opinion about questions that have objective answers? Why tolerate debate about policies that science has already determined? Why accept electoral defeats when you know your opponents represent the forces of reaction and oppression? The result is what I call democratic impatience, the inability to accept that good governance requires ongoing negotiation between competing values and interests. Political believers want final solutions to permanent problems. They want policies that flow logically from first principles rather than emerging from messy bargaining between flawed human beings with limited knowledge. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for defending democratic institutions against ideological assault. Democracy's greatest vulnerability isn't corruption or inefficiency but the psychological appeal of certainty in an uncertain world. Chapter 5: Sacred Texts and Infallible Leaders, the Infrastructure of Political Faith. Every mature political religion develops the institutional apparatus necessary to maintain doctrinal purity and coordinate collective belief. This infrastructure mirrors that of traditional religions so closely that observers can predict how ideological movements will evolve by studying how religious institutions handle questions of authority, interpretation, and dissent. The first requirement is sacred texts, writings that provide authoritative answers to fundamental questions and cannot be subjected to ordinary critical analysis. Marx's Capital served this function for communist movements, its complex arguments treated as revealed truth rather than economic theory open to empirical testing. Similarly, contemporary political movements develop their own canonical works that members must accept rather than examine. These texts acquire authority not through demonstrated accuracy but through internal coherence and emotional appeal. They offer comprehensive explanations for complex phenomena, creating the satisfying sense that all of reality fits together into a meaningful pattern. The believer experiences intellectual relief. Finally, someone has figured out how the world really works. But sacred texts require authoritative interpretation, which leads inevitably to hierarchies of spiritual authority. Lenin served this function for international communism, his writings providing definitive interpretations of Marx's more ambiguous passages. Contemporary movements develop their own versions of doctrinal authority, theorists whose interpretations cannot be questioned, activists whose lived experience provides privileged access to truth, intellectuals whose sophisticated analysis reveals hidden meanings in canonical texts. This creates what I call epistemological totalitarianism, the claim that certain individuals or groups possess special access to truth that ordinary reasoning cannot achieve. The authority figure doesn't just have better arguments, they have different ways of knowing that transcend normal intellectual limitations. Questioning their interpretations becomes not just wrong but impossible for anyone still trapped in conventional thinking. The psychological appeal is enormous. Followers gain access to transcendent wisdom without the burden of independent judgment. They can participate in ultimate truth while avoiding the anxiety of personal responsibility for complex decisions. The leader bears the weight of interpretation while the follower enjoys the comfort of certainty. I watched this dynamic play out repeatedly in French intellectual circles, observing how sophisticated thinkers gradually surrendered their critical independence to ideological authorities. The process was subtle but inexorable. First, certain questions became too complex for individual judgment. Only experts in dialectical materialism could properly understand economic developments. Then, certain experiences became necessary for valid insight. Only those who had lived through proletarian struggle could grasp its revolutionary implications. Eventually, independent thinking itself became suspect. Why rely on your own limited perspective when collective wisdom, mediated through proper authorities, could provide access to objective truth? Individual doubt wasn't just unhelpful, it was selfish, a form of intellectual pride that prevented participation in larger understanding. This surrender of intellectual autonomy has profound practical consequences. Once movement members accept that they cannot trust their own judgment about fundamental questions, they become capable of believing anything their authorities declare necessary. The gap between observable reality and official doctrine becomes irrelevant. Ordinary perception is simply inadequate for grasping higher truths. Democratic societies depend on citizens who maintain sufficient intellectual independence to evaluate competing claims and change their minds when presented with new evidence. This becomes impossible once people accept that certain authorities possess privileged access to truth that transcends normal reasoning processes. The antidote requires what I call democratic intellectual virtue, the capacity to hold strong convictions while preserving the ability to think critically about them. This means distinguishing between legitimate expertise and claims to infallible authority, between learning from others and surrendering independent judgment, between intellectual humility and intellectual abdication. Citizens in free societies must learn to navigate the complex relationship between individual reasoning and collective wisdom without falling into either arrogant individualism or servile dependence on ideological authorities. This is perhaps the most difficult intellectual skill democratic life requires. Chapter 6: The International Dimension: How Political Religions Cross Borders. Political religions possess an inherent tendency toward universalism that makes them particularly dangerous in international relations. Unlike traditional nationalisms that claim superiority for particular peoples, ideological movements claim access to universal truths that apply to all humanity. This creates both irresistible missionary impulses and fundamental incompatibility with the pluralistic assumptions that make peaceful coexistence possible. The communist movement provided the clearest example of this dynamic during my lifetime. Soviet communism wasn't simply a Russian political system but a universal ideology that claimed scientific validity for all societies. This created an obligation to spread the truth to benighted peoples still trapped in capitalist exploitation. Military intervention, revolutionary subversion, and ideological propaganda became not just strategic options but moral imperatives. What made this particularly dangerous was the movement's inability to accept the legitimacy of alternative systems. Coexistence with capitalism wasn't a practical accommodation between different societies but a temporary tactical necessity before the inevitable triumph of socialism. Democratic institutions weren't legitimate expressions of alternative values but bourgeois mystifications that would naturally disappear once people understood their true class interests. This ideological certainty made normal diplomatic relations nearly impossible. How do you negotiate with representatives of a system you believe is scientifically doomed? How do you compromise with people whose very existence contradicts your understanding of historical necessity? The believer faces a choice between abandoning their faith and rejecting the legitimacy of international order itself. I observed similar patterns in other universalist movements. Nazi ideology claimed biological superiority that transcended national boundaries, creating obligations to establish racial hierarchy wherever German power could reach. Contemporary political religions exhibit their own versions of missionary universalism, treating local customs and traditions as obstacles to enlightenment that must be overcome through education or pressure. This creates what I call ideological imperialism, the inability to accept that different societies might legitimately organize themselves according to different principles. The political believer cannot practice genuine cultural relativism because their ideology claims universal validity. Tolerance becomes not a virtue but a failure of nerve, an unwillingness to help benighted peoples discover the truth about their situation. The practical consequences for international relations are severe. Ideological powers cannot accept the principle of sovereignty that underlies the modern state system. If your ideology provides objective truth about human organization, then boundaries drawn by history or geography become irrelevant obstacles to the spread of enlightenment. Internal affairs of other nations become legitimate concerns whenever they conflict with ideological requirements. This dynamic explains why the Cold War was so much more dangerous than traditional great power competition. American and Soviet leaders weren't just competing for influence but representing incompatible visions of human organization that couldn't coexist indefinitely. Each side's domestic legitimacy depended partly on the eventual vindication of their universal claims. The contrast with genuine pluralism is striking. Democratic societies can accept that different peoples might organize themselves according to different values while still maintaining strong convictions about their own principles. They can compete vigorously with other systems while acknowledging their right to exist. They can promote their values through example and persuasion while accepting that others might reasonably choose different paths. This intellectual humility isn't weakness but wisdom. It recognizes that complex societies develop their institutions through historical processes that outsiders cannot fully understand or easily replicate. It acknowledges that human flourishing might take different forms in different contexts. Most importantly, it preserves space for peaceful competition between systems rather than requiring the elimination of alternatives. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for contemporary American foreign policy. The temptation to treat our democratic values as universal truths that all societies should adopt can lead to the same missionary impulses that made communist internationalism so dangerous. Promoting democracy works best when it respects the sovereignty and complexity of other societies rather than demanding immediate conformity to our preferred models. Chapter 7: The Democratic Alternative: Holding Convictions Without Certainty. The greatest challenge facing democratic societies isn't external threats but internal temptation, the recurring desire to escape from freedom's burden of uncertainty into the false comfort of ideological certainty. Developing democratic immunity to political religion requires cultivating intellectual virtues that allow citizens to hold strong convictions while preserving their capacity for critical thinking and genuine dialogue. This begins with understanding the difference between conviction and certainty. Democratic citizenship requires strong convictions about fundamental values, human dignity, individual rights, the possibility of reasonable disagreement, the importance of procedural fairness. These convictions provide the foundation for political action and civic engagement. But they must be held in a spirit of fallibilism that acknowledges human limitations and the possibility of error. The practical difference is enormous. Citizens with democratic convictions can argue passionately for their preferred policies while accepting that their opponents might have legitimate concerns they've overlooked. They can work energetically for political change while acknowledging that their reforms might have unintended consequences requiring future adjustment. They can maintain strong values while remaining genuinely curious about alternative perspectives. Citizens under the influence of political religion cannot do any of these things. Their certainty about ultimate truth makes compromise feel like betrayal and defeats feel like cosmic injustice. They lose the capacity for the intellectual humility that democratic governance requires. Developing this democratic temperament requires specific intellectual practices. First, citizens must learn to distinguish between empirical questions that can be resolved through evidence and value questions that involve irreducible disagreement between reasonable people. This prevents the false certainty that comes from treating political preferences as scientific facts. Second, democratic citizens need practice in what I call perspective taking, the ability to understand how intelligent, well-intentioned people might reach different conclusions about complex issues. This isn't moral relativism but intellectual sophistication. It recognizes that political questions involve multiple competing values that can't be perfectly balanced through logical deduction alone. Third, healthy democratic culture requires comfort with provisional solutions and ongoing revision. Citizens must accept that their finest achievements might be temporary, that changing circumstances will require fresh thinking, that even cherished institutions might need reform. This evolutionary approach to politics prevents the false permanence that ideological systems promise. Perhaps most importantly, democratic societies need citizens who can find meaning and purpose without requiring political validation. People who derive their entire sense of identity and worth from political causes become psychologically dependent on their movement's success. This makes them vulnerable to the totalitarian temptation, the willingness to sacrifice democratic procedures to achieve ideological goals. The alternative is what I call civic engagement without spiritual dependence, the ability to care deeply about political outcomes while maintaining emotional and intellectual independence from political movements. This allows citizens to support causes without becoming servants of those causes, to work for change without requiring that change to provide ultimate meaning. This democratic temperament must be actively cultivated through education and practice. Schools should teach students how to analyze competing arguments, how to acknowledge the limitations of their knowledge, how to change their minds when presented with new evidence. Citizens need opportunities to engage in genuine dialogue with people who disagree with them, experiences that demonstrate the possibility of reasonable disagreement between decent people. Most importantly, democratic societies must resist the temptation to treat their own values as absolute truths beyond questioning. The moment democracy becomes a political religion, complete with infallible principles and heretical thoughts, it ceases to be democracy. The system survives only as long as its citizens maintain the intellectual humility to question even their deepest convictions about what democracy requires. This is perhaps the hardest lesson democratic life teaches, that preserving freedom requires accepting uncertainty, that protecting pluralism demands rejecting absolutism, that maintaining democracy means resisting the very human desire to escape from the burden of thinking for ourselves. Conclusion. The transformation of politics into religion represents democracy's greatest internal threat. When citizens begin treating political movements as sources of ultimate truth and transcendent meaning, they lose the capacity for the reasoned deliberation that democratic governance requires. They become believers rather than citizens, followers rather than thinkers. The antidote isn't cynicism or disengagement but intellectual virtue. Democratic societies need citizens who can hold strong convictions without claiming absolute certainty, who can engage passionately in political causes without surrendering their capacity for independent judgment, who can work for change while accepting that democratic progress requires ongoing dialogue between competing perspectives. This requires constant vigilance against our own temptation to escape uncertainty through ideological commitment. The desire for political religion is deeply human. It offers relief from the anxiety of freedom and the burden of personal responsibility. But succumbing to this temptation destroys the very possibility of democratic life. Democracy's survival depends on citizens who can resist the false comfort of absolute answers in favor of the difficult but essential work of thinking together about complex problems. This is the intellectual courage that free societies require, not the certainty of the believer but the principled doubt of the democratic citizen who knows that preserving freedom means preserving the right to question everything, including our most cherished beliefs.